The air inside the Vatican press hall was heavy, as if the very walls understood that history was about to be torn open. Rows of journalists sat pressed together, their pens and recorders poised like soldiers at the ready. Cameras hummed and clicked, red lights burning like watchful eyes that would carry this moment into every living room on Earth. Before we continue, kindly comment where you are watching from and subscribe to this channel. At the center stood Pope Leo XIV. He did not shift under the weight of so many gazes. His white robes fell in calm, unshaken lines, his hands folded in front of him as if he were holding both patience and fire in equal measure. His face was grave, but not defeated, serene, but not soft. He looked as though he had seen storms before and had walked through them untouched. In the front row, Ryan Caldwell, a well-respected journalist, leaned forward with an air of triumph already glowing in his expression. He had practiced the question he would deliver, the trap he would set, the moment he believed would expose the Pope as a relic of a crumbling faith. In his mind, this was not a holy gathering, it was a stage, and he was ready to claim it. The question came, sharp and deliberate, carrying the weight of mockery beneath its polished tone. Your Holiness, are you truly prepared to stand before billions of believers and announce that the celebration of Christmas Mass will be forbidden? Do you understand what you are taking from them? The words rang across the marble hall like a stone-shattering stained glass. Some reporters gasped, others exchanged quick glances, eager to see how the Bishop of Rome could possibly recover from such a charge. Ryan Caldwell sat back in his chair, convinced that he had struck a mortal blow against the authority of the Church. But the man at the podium did not flinch. His eyes, steady and clear, held not the defensiveness of a cornered leader, but the stillness of one rooted in something far deeper than approval. He let the silence hang, long enough for unease to ripple through the room. And when he opened his mouth, his voice carried not haste but weight, as though every syllable was carved from stone. What he said next did not simply answer the question. It silenced the world. And as this story unfolds, don't be a spectator. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you will be notified when we release our next video. Pope Leo XIV had not risen from the gilded staircases of power, but from the dust of obscurity. Born into poverty, his childhood was marked not by privilege, but by the echo of empty cupboards and the quiet dignity of parents who worked their hands raw to feed their family. In the narrow streets where he first learned to pray, faith was not theory, it was bread survival, the warmth of candles in a freezing room. As a young man, he was not shielded from suffering but immersed in it, ministering to those the world had already forgotten. Orphans abandoned in crumbling villages, widows who wept alone, laborers bent double under burdens no human shoulders should carry. His priesthood carried the scent of dirt roads and the weight of real tears. It was this history, this furnace of lived compassion, that had forged him into the man who now stood at the helm of the Catholic Church. And yet, though he wore the white robes of the papacy, he bore none of the arrogance that sometimes accompanies such rank. Instead, he carried a reputation that unsettled many, a reformer. He was the Pope who refused palatial excess, who had been seen dining with beggars, who often placed mercy above protocol. Loved by many, resented by others, he was not a man afraid of controversy. To some, he was the voice of the Church's future. To others, he was the hammer striking too close to sacred tradition. Across from him sat the challenger, Ryan Caldwell, the journalist who now dared to confront him in this hour. He was a man whose confidence preceded him, sleek and precise, the kind of speaker who knew how to sharpen his words into weapons. In his circles, he was celebrated as the rational voice of modernity, the figure who would peel away old illusions with the knife of reason. To his admirers, he was fearless, to his critics, ruthless. He came not as a seeker but as an accuser, convinced that faith was a crumbling edifice, and he had arrived to push the first stone. The stage was nothing short of global. The Vatican press hall, usually a place of carefully measured announcements, now swelled with a different kind of energy. This was no ordinary briefing. The words already uttered, that Christmas Mass, the holiest celebration in Christendom, would be banned this year, had ripped through the world like lightning. Screens across continents flickered with the headline. Families sat frozen before televisions. Priests stood speechless at their pulpits. Politicians whispered in urgent tones. It was the first time in history that the Church itself had declared a silence over the celebration most central to its identity. Why it mattered could not be overstated. For billions, Christmas Mass was more than ritual. It was the anchor of hope, the summit of faith, the moment where light broke into winter's darkness. To imagine it stripped away was unthinkable, And yet here, before a watching world, the Pope himself had pronounced it. The announcement had struck not only believers but also skeptics, for even those who did not share the faith understood its cultural gravity. The air in the press hall was therefore more than tense, it was suffused with disbelief. Ryan Caldwell, sensing opportunity, now leaned forward as though to harvest the anger of the millions who felt betrayed. And here is where you, the listener, must decide what kind of witness you will be. This story is not a whisper, it is thunder rolling across the earth. If you do not stand among those who choose to see clearly, then you will drift as one of the countless voices that dismiss, that mock, that forget. If you have not subscribed yet, this is the time to do so before we continue to the next part of this interesting confrontation. Ryan Caldwell's pause was deliberate, calculated. He allowed the murmurs to swell, to carry the impression that he had struck at the heart of the faithful's anguish. His pen tapped softly against the notebook in his hand, as though each beat were a reminder to himself that he was still in control, still the one driving the conversation. His eyes narrowed slightly, betraying the satisfaction of a man who believed he had cornered his prey. He cleared his throat once more, layering his tone with the same measured reverence, yet every syllable carried a hidden barb. "Your Holiness," he said, "for centuries the Church has held Christmas Mass as the pinnacle of faith's expression, a night when heaven and earth draw close. Do you not fear that your decision will be remembered not as an act of guidance, but as a wound inflicted on the very body of believers? What will they cling to, if not the rituals you have chosen to withhold?" It was a masterful question in the eyes of the press, phrased as concern, delivered as accusation. Several reporters nodded, scribbling furiously, already framing headlines. A few glanced at each other with raised brows, silently acknowledging the audacity of the moment. Yet Pope Leo XIV remained utterly unmoved. He did not rush, did not allow himself to be carried on the current of the journalists' theater. He simply lifted his eyes from the lectern and gazed across the assembly, not as though he were defending himself against them, but as though he were searching their souls for the truth they had long buried. "Wounds," he said at last, his voice calm but resonant, "are not inflicted when a man calls his people back to the essence of their faith. Wounds are inflicted when we allow ritual to overshadow reality, when we confuse the shadow for the light. My decision is not to rob the faithful, but to remind them that the Mass itself is not God. God does not vanish because we choose silence. On the contrary, in silence he speaks most clearly." There was a stillness then, heavy and unrelenting. Even the scratching of pens ceased for a moment, as though the hall itself bowed under the weight of the words. Reporters shifted uneasily, some frowned, others leaned back in their chairs, uncertain of their footing. But Ryan Caldwell pressed on, unwilling to concede ground. He leaned forward, voice still cloaked in civility, but edged now with urgency. "Yet surely, Holy Father, you cannot dismiss the anguish of the faithful. They look to you for guidance, for constancy. Without this Mass, what remains to anchor their devotion? Will you not appear as a shepherd who closes the gate on his own flock?" The Pope's eyes did not waver. He allowed the charge to hang, to settle like dust, and then answered with the patience of one who had weathered storms far fiercer than the words of a single man. "A shepherd who closes a gate does so not to abandon, but to guard. Sometimes, the pasture must lie fallow so that its grass may grow again. Sometimes, the sheep must be led into silence so that they might remember the sound of the shepherd's voice. Christmas is not cancelled, it cannot be cancelled. For Christ does not dwell in one night, nor in one liturgy, but in every act of love, in every moment where sacrifice gives life to another." The murmurs returned, stronger now, spreading like ripples across a pond struck by a stone. Some reporters looked shaken, caught between the authority of centuries and the clarity of the Pope's words. Ryan Caldwell shifted in his chair, the mask of absolute confidence flickering as he recalibrated. He had expected a defensive pontiff, scrambling to justify a controversial decree. Instead, he faced a man who seemed untouchable, anchored in a truth that made the argument feel small. Ryan Caldwell's words grew sharper still, and with them the weight of the hall seemed to shift. His pen no longer rested on his notebook, it jabbed like a spear as he gestured toward the Pope. His voice carried a sneer of accusation masked as inquiry. "You dress your decision in poetry, Your Holiness, but to the faithful who wait year after year for the light of Christmas Mass, your words sound like excuses. You speak of silence and suffering, yet it is you who has imposed silence upon them. Does the widow you praise not deserve the bells? Does the refugee not deserve the candlelit midnight hymn? Have you, in the name of purity, robbed them of joy?" A ripple of agreement murmured through a portion of the crowd. Some nodded with vigor, as though he had spoken for them. Others shook their heads, unsettled by the boldness, perhaps even offended by the arrogance of addressing the Pope with such contempt. Pope Leo XIV stood unmoved. His eyes did not harden, though his voice deepened, carrying the weight of both sorrow and conviction. "You mistake joy for noise, my son." The widow's candle shone brighter because it was lit in ruin. The refugee's prayer was stronger because it rose from despair. "You believe that joy is given by the music, the procession, the grand cathedral, but I tell you, it is born in the soul when it recognizes Christ present in its darkness. To deprive them of ritual is not to rob them, it is to awaken them. The faithful will learn that the manger is not in a church of stone but in the human heart." Ryan Caldwell shifted in his seat, his confidence flickering. Yet he pressed on, unwilling to surrender ground. His tone rose, desperate now to reclaim authority. "Then what of the billions who will feel abandoned? They see you as the guardian of tradition, the keeper of sacred continuity. They will say you have betrayed them, that you have broken trust. Will you deny them the right to name you the Pope who destroyed Christmas?" The room tensed. Even the cameras seemed to pause, their lenses fixed as though reluctant to blink. Reporters leaned forward, eyes darting between the defiant journalist and the calm pontiff. The words "destroyed Christmas" echoed like thunder across the hall, daring the Pope to stumble beneath their force. But Leo XIV did not stumble. His lips curved, not in a smile, but in a sorrowful grace. His reply came like a steady flame against a roaring wind. "I have destroyed nothing. I have sought to reveal what cannot be destroyed. You speak as though Christ were bound to one night, one service, one ritual act. But I have seen him in a mother cradling her starving child, whispering hymns into the silence of hunger. I have seen him in a grieving father laying flowers on a grave, believing still in resurrection. Are these not Christmas masses, lived in flesh and blood? Tell me, who betrays faith more, the shepherd who calls his flock back to its essence, or the accuser who insists that without pageantry there is no Christ?" The hall fell into uneasy silence. A cough echoed in the back. Ryan Caldwell opened his mouth, but no words came. His posture betrayed him, shoulders tense, lips pressed too tightly. He had thought himself the voice of reason, yet he now felt reason slipping from his grasp. The Pope leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, intimate, as if speaking to the soul of the room itself. "Politics divides. The gospel unites. You see division because you measure faith in rituals and power. But I measure it in love. Ritual without love is empty. But love, even without ritual, is unbreakable. This is the lesson you resist, my son, because it demands humility, not spectacle." A wave of silence swept across the hall. Reporters stared wide-eyed, some visibly shaken, others too unsettled to write. Ryan Caldwell sat frozen, his carefully constructed poise crumbling in the presence of words that rang truer than his own. "And you who listen now are not spectators alone. This is a crossroads, a confrontation not just between a pope and a journalist, but between truth and spectacle, between unity and division. If you have ears to hear, then do not remain silent. If you've enjoyed this story, like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never missed our upcoming videos." The silence that had gripped the press hall was not enough for Ryan Caldwell. He could feel himself losing ground, and desperation pushed him further than he had intended. His composure, once polished and carefully measured, shattered under the weight of the Pope's calm authority. He leaned forward, voice raised, words sharp with fury. "Enough of your stories, Holy Father. Enough of your lofty talk of widows and refugees. The world is not naive, and neither am I. This is not about faith. This is about control. Tell us, are you not simply a puppet of the elites? Is this so-called ban on Christmas Mass not part of a global agenda to weaken Christianity, to strip away the traditions that bind people together? Who is truly speaking here, you or the powers behind you?" The words struck like a hammer. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some reporters covered their mouths in shock, others craned forward eagerly, sensing the moment they had been waiting for, the mask of reverence torn off, the accusation laid bare. Ryan Caldwell's tone carried open contempt now, his voice thick with the thrill of defiance. Cameras zoomed, pens scratched furiously, the atmosphere was electric, heavy with the raw scent of conflict. But Pope Leo XIV did not flinch. His expression did not harden, nor did he raise his voice in retaliation. Instead, he allowed the accusation to hang in the air, suspended in its own arrogance. Then, with a calm that seemed to quiet even the restless clicking of cameras, he spoke. "My son," he began, his voice lower now, more intimate, as though he addressed not just Ryan Caldwell but every soul within reach. "You speak of powers and agendas because you see the world only through chains of suspicion. You measure faith as though it were a currency, as though it could be manipulated and traded in the halls of men. But I tell you this, faith is not the possession of elites. It is the cry of the poor, the hope of the persecuted, the song of the dying who cling to Christ with their last breath." He paused, and in that pause the air itself seemed to tighten. Then he went on, his words heavy with memory. "I have knelt beside children whose bodies were broken by famine, and I have heard them whisper prayers more powerful than any speech I could give in this hall. I have stood in places where believers risked death to gather in secret, where their altar was a wooden box and their hymn a trembling whisper in the dark. Were they puppets of elites? No. They were the free, the faithful, and the brave." Ryan Caldwell's bravado faltered. He tried to interrupt, but the Pope's gaze fixed him in place, unyielding yet not cruel. "You call it naive," the Pope declared, his voice rising now, rich with a restrained fire, "to protect the innocent, to guard the poor, to lift up the broken. But I tell you, it is not naive. It is sacred. Sacred beyond politics. Sacred beyond agendas. Sacred beyond the cynicism you wear like armor." The words struck harder than any rebuke could. The press hall fell into utter stillness. Reporters who had moments earlier scribbled frantically now froze, their pens hovering above paper. The audience, so quick to murmur and gasp, found themselves silenced. Even the cameras, with their relentless blinking lights, seemed subdued by the weight of the moment. The Ryan Caldwell sat rigid, his face drained of color, the smirk he had carried now replaced with something else, unease, perhaps even shame. His question had sought to unmask a fraud, but it was his own motives that now lay bare. The Pope lowered his voice once more, solemn and resolute. "The world craves division. It thrives on suspicion. But the gospel calls us higher. To stand for the innocent, no matter how costly, no matter how misunderstood. That is not a weakness. That is strength. That is faith." The silence that followed was not empty. It was holy, the kind of silence that presses into the soul and demands an answer. The air in the room seemed heavier, charged with something beyond politics, beyond debate. The Pope's voice lowered further, his final words carrying the tone of prayer. "My hope is not that the world remembers this day as the day a Mass was withheld, but as the day hearts remembered to listen again. For faith is not a performance. It is a posture of the soul. May we remember this truth, not with noise, not with pride, but with listening hearts." The shift was complete. The battle had become a benediction. The tension of confrontation dissolved into a moment that felt strangely like worship, though no hymn was sung, no altar raised. What would you have spoken, had you been seated in that room when the press hall grew still, when Pope Leo's words bent the atmosphere and left every soul suspended between pride and humility? Would you have risen with accusation, as Ryan Caldwell did, convinced of your own cleverness, sure that truth must bow before suspicion? Or would you have allowed the weight of his silence, the tenderness of his appeal, to touch the deeper places of your heart? This is no distant curiosity. It is the very question that now sits before you. Do not imagine this was a moment confined to marble walls and flashing cameras. No. This was a mirror held to the conscience of all who heard it. And now that mirror is before you. If you had been there, what words would have passed your lips? Would you have offered doubt, or would you have chosen reverence? Would you have fought to preserve noise, or would you have chosen to listen? Tell us plainly. Share your thoughts below, for silence without testimony does not stand apart. It sides with the very chaos it pretends to avoid. And as this reflection deepens, receive the blessing hidden within his final pivot, a blessing that was less declared than lived in his very stillness. May we seek the truth not with arrogance but with humility. May we carry listening hearts into a world addicted to its own noise. May light itself, unbroken by shouting, uncorrupted by spectacle, shine through even in the silence of Christmas, and beyond into every shadow that craves dawn. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment now to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos when released.